We often hear that our COA education is an exploration or an adventure. As students, we are asked to navigate this self-designed curriculum. Or at least this was a metaphor that we were presented with on our first day here by the speakers at orientation and convocation. We were also presented with it on our last day here, as Bill Carpenter related in his speech last night. In the past year, though, I have begun to realize that for me, my COA education was a lot like going to the theater. As I walked into my senior year, I had been studying environmental politics, anthropology, education, graphic design, many other things. Really, the sequence of courses I took probably would make very little sense to anyone without an extensive narrative to go along with it. But I actually have something like that. It's my human ecology essay. What I realized after studying all of those different things is that none of these initial metaphors really allowed me to consider how I felt about what I was learning. I watched negotiators at the United Nations discuss their potential action to change the world's present. I watched them discuss what the future of the world might look like or should look like. And deep down, I was genuinely very frustrated at their pace and at how exclusive their work was, to name a few things. However, telling others that the UN frustrated me wasn't really going to get me anywhere. The funny thing is, I'm sure the way things work at the United Nations right now probably frustrates many of the negotiators themselves. I can imagine it also frustrates the co-chairs, the people who facilitate these diplomatic encounters and then have to go write 700-page documents that no one's going to read. Quite honestly, watching this happen time after time, negotiation after negotiation, city after city, made me quite depressed and ultimately very, very cynical. It felt like ultimately we were trying to change a system that was too strong or too established for us to even budget. And this is how I found theater. This is why I began to use theater to think about my time here, and why I began to use it seriously to consider the problems of the United Nations. Theater lets me not only honor those visceral reactions that this type of work causes in me, but also ask that I consider how I feel and what other people feel, and use these feelings very intentionally in our collective work. I began to think of my classes as practice, as rehearsal for the real world. And this turn towards theater made me realize that all of my past work, all my explorations up until that point had been linked by one common theme, the suspension of disbelief. Throughout my educational journey here, I have had to trust and have faith that in the end, this seemingly disconnected exploration would make sense and would help me exist in the world. I also had to suspend my disbelief to allow my imagination and my emotions to help me make connections between marine policy and acting, between animation and chemistry, or printmaking and theater. Because theater totally depends on suspending our disbelief about what we're going to watch, using it as a metaphor for education broke down many walls for me. And I began to make connections that honestly seemed very absurd to others, but felt insanely real to me. So here I was with this idea fermenting in the back of my head, that my education was practice for the real world, that my feelings influenced my acting or my performance as a student. And then I began to think of the college as an actual theater, a theater with numerous instances where we watch each other create wonderful pieces of work that change how we think and how we feel. Then after watching each other, we then spend time thinking about what we've experienced together. We talk about it, and we discuss it, we feel the performances with each other, and then we walk out of these performances with new thoughts and new ideas that we incorporate into our actions, into the way we live in the world. With all of this theater talk, I decided to really put to test the idea that theater had something to contribute to the problems of the world. For this, I picked the largest and most pressing problem that I could think of: how the United Nations kept failing and failing and failing and failing to produce meaningful, effective outcomes. To think about this and to try to find a solution, I wrote a play for my senior project. The catch is that I've never written a play before. What really drove me to do it, along with convincing by Jody Baker that the idea was super, super valid, is that I told myself that even though the final product might be really, really weird or boring, that I was going to learn a lot in the process. And theater and politics were two things I really, really cared about. So at least it seemed worth trying. Here's that suspension of disbelief again. So I went about trying to represent the state of the negotiations and trying to show the ways I think they're messed up and confusing. With support from other students, faculty, and staff, we prepared a stage reading for the college of the play. Things looked a little bleak at first. The script had turned out to be so accurate that during one of the rehearsals, at least half of my actors were yawning as we were reading it. So I had to ask them, if you don't remember any of my notes from the rehearsal, just remember to keep your mouth closed if you're yawning. So that the audience doesn't yawn with you, because you know, yawn is contagious. But then something happened at the performance, at the reading, that baffled me and made me realize not just the value of using theater very intentionally, but of changing one's metaphors and not doing same things the way everybody else does it, or because they have worked that way in the past. At the reading, people were laughing quite a bit. And it wasn't necessarily the amount of laughter that was fascinating to me, but the fact that that play, being so specific, could create this sort of common experience among people from very different backgrounds and interests. There was room for empathy in that space amongst people who were perhaps only acquaintances, people who had been to the United Nations and people who had never been there, people who had spent time preparing and reading tons of drafts, and people who perhaps had only first heard about it right there, about the process of the negotiations right there. And thinking about this shared understanding in relation to the United Nations that my play had instilled in the audience made something really click on me. That this sort of shared understanding is kind of the point of the United Nations themselves. And using this different metaphor to think about what I was doing here as a student opened many things for me. I was able to use new aspects of myself. I was able to reinvent uses for things I already knew from before. And ultimately, it did away with even the most depressing problem in the world for me. That play, at least for me, had been super life-changing. Just as I left the theater that day, we are all leaving this theater today, and we step into the world that all of these performances ultimately come from. And I don't want to tell you to go and change your metaphors every day, but what I want to say is that sometimes what seems completely absurd may be the way to find the answers that you're looking for, and the best way to share those with others. Even more so, changing my metaphors helped me find what was meaningful for me, and I really, really hope that as we all walk away from here, it can maybe do the same for all of you. Thank you very much.